So we are part of the What Works Network, which was set up by the UK government to build on the success of organizations such as the National Institute for Clinical Excellence and the Education Endowment Foundation, which have, I think, now really international reputations for the use of evidence in policymaking. And so there are a number of What Works centers that were set up about 7 years ago, and there are more being added all the time. And they deal with issues such as homelessness and education and young people into employment, crime, aging, well-being. And we have a very specific focus on economic development, local economic development, which makes us unique. And it's very much a new approach to policymaking at the local level. And if we can move on to the next slide, please. These are the kind of objectives that we look at. We are exclusively focused, partly because we are very small, we have a small budget, but also because we wanted to produce work that is really easy for local authorities, where people are very busy and have a lot of things on their plate, where they can pick up and look at economic objectives that will really affect the people who live in their area. So we have narrowed down the objectives that we think are most important to wages, employment, and productivity. And I would especially focus for local areas on wages and employment. There are a lot of other objectives that people talk about when they are looking at local economic growth, and that includes things like, business churn and property values. But for our thinking, wages and employment are the two areas that most directly affect local people across the board. And while we will often include findings on things like property prices, or even in this case, green impact, the outcomes that are ultimately most important to us are wages and employment. So I know that sometimes that's frustrating, because especially when there are other areas that are of great interest right now, such as well-being, and health, but that's the focus that we have. And so if you can move on to the next slide, please. The evidence that we consider, so we are responsible for sort of collating all of the evidence about what works in terms of local economic policy. And we've looked at studies from across the world, across all the OECD countries. Anything that was pretty much in English over the past 30 years has been included in our database of evidence. But we put most of our focus on studies that include a comparator group. So not quite randomized controlled trials, although we love those, but any project any analysis that includes the outcome for people who went through a program, or businesses that received a treatment, or areas that had transport improvements compared to places that didn't. And this is still quite a fresh field for local economic growth. A lot of these kinds of comparisons have been done for employment training, fewer for business support, and even fewer for things like transport and property projects. I used to work for the London Development Agency. I mean, in the 90s, I worked on single regeneration budget programs, and we would look at the number of jobs, the number of people who went through our employment training projects, and whether or not they got jobs, and be really pleased that out of 100, it turned out that 50 people who went through our employment training program got a job in the end. What I never considered back then was what happens to the similar 100 people who didn't go through a training program, who were just out looking for a job on their own. And when you find out in some cases that 50 people who weren't in the training program also got jobs, it shows that the money you spent didn't have the impact that you wanted. And in lots of cases, you can find out that you did a lot better than you expected, and that you had a great impact on local people. So this is how we approach the evidence, always with these fairly rigorous approaches. And it does mean that sometimes our evidence base is very small, and we always encourage people to do evaluations like this so we can build up that evidence base. If you want to move on to the next slide, please. I just wanted to pull out some key themes about local economic growth that have come out of our work over the last 7 years. One is about being very clear about your objectives. So if you're trying to get an economic benefit and you are investing in things like sports and culture, we would argue that you should invest in sports and culture because they are good for people's health and well-being, and they bring a lot of liveliness to an area. The evidence suggests that economic development objectives are not really met by sport and culture projects. They don't bring as much of an economic benefit as people like to think, based on the studies that have been done to date. And we think that that's not a reason not to do sports and culture projects, as an example. We think that the money that you might spend paying consultants to do an economic impact assessment, which can be quite expensive. Take that money and put it back into the project and make the project as good as you can for local people. Don't always be piling economic objectives onto different kinds of projects that don't necessarily offer them. The second thing is to think really clearly about who will benefit. And this is a big issue for inclusive growth, which I know everyone is thinking about right now. Things like business profitability and property prices. Those are all good things that can show liveliness in the local economy, but they aren't necessarily benefiting the people who need support the most. So that's again why we come back to this focus on employment and wages, which benefit people across the board. And finally, thinking critically about sustainability of any economic development project. You need to be careful about business displacement, for example. So if you put in a new shopping center, we've seen shopping centers on some of our city visits that are beautiful and they're full of retail, and around the corner is a more rundown shopping center that is now empty because the business is all shifted from one to the other. So displacement is a big issue that we always encourage people to think about. And the other one is about what will happen when your project ends and how you make your project sustainable over the longer term. The next slide, please. We have on our website, we have policy reviews that we hope cover evidence from across all of the major fields of local economic developments. There's a list of them here, but you can find them on our website. These are really thorough evidence reviews that include all kinds of background on the policy area and what has been shown to work best from evidence across the world. The next slide shows our toolkits, which are more focused on implementation and more specific details about how, if you are running an apprenticeship program, how you can bring mentoring and get that involved in your program and what things you need to think about. If you're making transport improvements, it would be more specific about things like real-time information. Next slide is a quick look at our COVID-19 recovery work. We tried to do rapid evidence reviews on areas that we know local places are thinking about right now. Again, these are all on our website, and I would particularly point people towards youth unemployment and scarring. This is such a big problem right now for our young people coming into an economy where they are going to have struggled to find jobs, and we know that the impact on them is going to last long into the future. So we've put together briefings on each one of these topics that are specific to COVID recovery. And the next slide is moving on to green investments. So we worked closely with the Grantham Institute at the London School of Economics and the Center for Economic Performance, who were doing this big piece of work on what kind of green investments brought the best results. And we were interested, as ever, on the local perspective on these green investments, because often when we talk about green recovery, we're talking about things like reducing carbon output, and those things are important. But at a local level, first of all, local authorities often don't have the kind of tools that can really affect things like carbon output in a meaningful way. They may not be able to choose where they get their power from and whether or not they're using renewable resources. But there are other, and they may also be swamped by international impacts of manufacturing and policy in other countries. So we encourage local places to focus on projects that will benefit the people there. And that would focus more on things that reduce air pollution, that reduce congestion, and because we're focused on economic outputs, also investments that will create jobs or improve people's wages. So looking at the work that Grantham had done at international policy, we thought that the three areas that were most important for local places were active travel, energy efficiency, and investment in natural capital. And Councillor Mary just spoke a bit about active travel. Active travel is a great investment for local places in green recovery because it does create jobs. I mean, it is quite labor intensive putting in these cycle lanes and improve pedestrian areas. It does improve the public realm, but it also reduces congestion. And all of this will have an impact eventually on the local economy for the better. But they also produce benefits that local people will feel kind of immediately, things like reduced pollution. It's good for their health. It's good for well-being to use active travel. So that is an investment that we think is a really good bet. The second one is energy efficiency, and this mostly takes the form of retrofitting programs. And especially for places where you have an older housing stock, investing in retrofitting for energy efficiency is a great way to, again, employ people. The jobs that come with this type of work are usually quite good and can also help people improve their skills in ways that'll be more marketable sort of across the country. They do reduce pollution, and they really have a massive impact on people's health and well-being living in buildings that are more energy efficient. Also improves or gives people more money in their pocket because they're spending less money on energy. It's also good for business profitability. So that's another really good bet on the local level. And the last one is natural capital. And this is kind of investment in your local environments, you know, everything from tree planting to, you know, improving your riverside. And this not only creates jobs in the work itself, but also can be really good for tourism and health and well-being, again, getting people out into the countryside. So again, it's that balance between economic outputs and well-being, and also the green improvements that we want to see. If you can go on to the next slide. I just wanted to pull out lessons to consider kind of across the board when you're thinking about green investment and green recovery, and also dealing with the deep economic pit that many local places find themselves in right now. And that is that, you know, there will be a trade-off between economic benefits and green benefits. So in many cases, if what you really want to do is create jobs and you're not concerned about green investment or green recovery, then you might want to invest in something that's a little more economic minded and will create more jobs for your money. But we understand that this focus on green recovery and making the best out of the situation means that people will want to make green investments, and we encourage that. Just be aware of the trade-offs and make sure you have an understanding of where your money is going and what kind of an impact it's going to have. The second one is just always you need to think about your local situation. So if you're in a place where, as I said earlier, you know, you have a lot of old housing that needs to be improved in terms of economic efficiency, that could be your best investment. If you live in a place where you have beautiful local natural resources and you want to improve people's ability to get out there, and that can really improve your tourist economy, that's where you want to make your investment. So as always, you know, it's about understanding your local area. And of course, you know, Councillor Mary was talking about this earlier as well. You're in the best position to know what your local area has and what it needs. And finally, I mean, we always encourage people to do good evaluation. I mean, good evaluation, it can take up a lot of effort and it can be expensive. And that's why we're here to help people with it. Because even if you undertake a project and you find out that it didn't work the way you wanted it to work, there are all kinds of lessons to be learned from that. So evaluation is very important. If you go on to the next slide, I just have a little list of the things that we do to help. We can offer ad hoc advice. We run special projects that look in depth at particular topical issues like COVID recovery, or we looked at Brexit in the UK a couple of years ago. And finally, we will run online workshops for your team to learn more about evidence-based policy and evaluation. It's all free, and please get in touch with me, and I'm happy to talk to you about any of this in more detail. There's also more on our website. And thanks very much for having me here today. I hope that some of this is helpful.